You heard me. I won't be in for the rest of the week. I told you. My baby beat me up. Oh, it is not the worst excuse I ever thought of.
Hello, and welcome to the Simpsons Countdown, the podcast where we go back to the beginning and watch all of The Simpsons to trace the creative evolution of the series and count down, finding the exact moment in which it began its inevitable decline. I'm your host, Erix Antoine, and this week I'm joined by Natalia Castro, a dear friend of mine calling in from Colombia. We'll be discussing the episode Itchy and Scratchy and Marge, which originally aired in the US on December 20th, 1990. In this episode, Maggie attacks Homer with a mallet, and Marge blames the Itchy and Scratchy Show for its negative influence, subsequently going on a crusade to get them to sanitize this violent cartoon. But in the end, she finds that this type of activism through well-meaning censorship is a bit of a double-edged sword, as she's expected to apply that same mentality to the puritanical extreme of censoring classic works of art. It's a witty episode that takes an honest look at the issue of parents wanting to exercise some control over the content of their children's entertainment, perhaps acting as a response to criticisms The Simpsons had already received for its perceived edginess. But the issue observed continues to be relevant, even topical, today. Who has the right, ultimately, to control what is expressed through art? Should anyone? Oh yes, that's what Natalia and I are going to be talking about, so hang on to your hats. And without further ado, here we go. All right, so welcome back, Natalia. How you doing?
I am alive. How about you?
I am also alive, and I think
Yay.
that it feels good. It feels good to be alive.
Well, yes. Sometimes, most of the time. Sometimes it's kind of sad.
You see the born to be alive, born to be alive.
Well, happy about that. So we're here to talk about The Simpsons. We're here to talk about Itchy and Scratchy and Marge.
Yes, a controversial one.
Yes, well, I don't even know to what extent it was controversial at the time, but when I watched it recently, when I watched it now, it struck me how it turns out to be pretty topical for now, for the current climate that we are living in. There are elements in this episode that I think are relevant, and I thought that was interesting.
That's like a normal thing for The Simpsons.
Well, yes. At the time, they were playing off of things that were real. I mean, what it was doing was, they're making fun of Tipper Gore, basically,
Yeah.
and they're making fun of things that were going on at the time with these groups wanting to crack down on entertainment, and where you had, they felt that kids had access to entertainment that was not appropriate for them, like hip hop records and, rock and roll records and heavy metal records, and video games and all these things that were reaching a level where maybe some of that content in that entertainment was maybe not appropriate for certain people, and it was creating kind of a stir. And some good did come of this, but at the same time, there was a lot of stuff going around that was kind of, just silly, really. And in a way, that mentality, that attitude does persist to this day, and we see it reflected in different things, but people still take a different approach. And it's just interesting to me that this episode, which at the time was commenting on something that was, of the time, can still be relevant, because that sort of situation continues to happen now, maybe in a different context, but it's the same basic idea.
Yeah, it feels more political now.
Yes, it definitely has more of a, let's say, political bent to it. And I think there's one thing that maybe this applies to you and me, because like I'm from the U.S. I was born and raised in New York City, but I have lived outside of the U.S. for, at this point, at least more than half of my life. I mean, at this point, bouncing back and forth, but if we're being technical, I have been living out of the U.S. for over 25 years.
Uh-huh.
So by this point, a lot of this stuff, I have kind of an outsider's perspective, and I think that you can appreciate this. We're in Latin America, and when you look at the way things happen in the U.S., a lot of that stuff does tend to seem very hysterical, might be the word. I don't know. Do you know what I'm getting at?
It looks nuts.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
it's always, and in particular, like I'm curious. So because we're talking about censorship, and we're going to get to it. We're going to get to that. But anytime that any of those scandals come out and they show up on the news, and because we're all global now, we're on the internet, so we have access to Facebook and whatever else, and we know what's going on all over the place. So if you have an interest, you start looking into it, and so we find out about these things.
Yeah.
And a lot of these social movements and these events and these things of great impact that happen, that start in the U.S., some of them take hold and eventually start spreading to other places. But really, it's like each place has their own movements.
Yeah.
But some of these hashtags and things that end up happening, they start in the U.S.
Yes.
And there is this general impression of and I can only speak for myself and from my circle and from where I'm sitting, and that's why I'm wondering if it's the same for you. There is this general impression of a hypersensitivity.
Yeah.
Do you agree? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, everyone seems more sensitive to anything, more sensitive to criticism. I think there's a lot of confusion with the concepts of criticism and censorship. And I'm also constantly a little concerned about the massive influence that America has on other countries, like the United States has on other countries. Well, with the whole the recording of police brutality and all that I think that's a positive influence, right? Because as soon as all those videos started to come out on TV, that started happening here in Colombia. Like people started like recording police brutality.
Good.
At the same time, with I think it was during 2016 with Trump and all the crap he said, it also motivated a lot of people here to act very badly. So this episode was about taking care of impressionable young minds, but I think it's generally about impressionable minds. Depending on how you grew up and what you believe in, you're going to take the good examples or the bad examples. It's just hard to see like foreign countries just taking the bad examples and applying them.
Yeah, so let's talk about this episode for a second here. Let's go over it. I like what you said, that it's about impressionable minds.
Yeah.
That's a very good point, because that's basically what it is, isn't it? It's the whole thing about, look at this is not appropriate content for my kids to be watching. It's something that maybe you don't, at that moment, you don't pick up on it until later, but there is something to be said where it doesn't have an influence on Bart and Lisa, a negative influence. They look at it as entertainment, they laugh, and it doesn't affect them in a negative way. However, Maggie does take a negative influence from it. Yeah. And it's almost as if to say that, yes, of course, there can be violent films or violent films, violent video games, which can influence people to commit violence, but those people already have to have something in them that would cause them to go that way. And that's an interesting point. That's something to, it's part of a greater debate that we can have about the effect that violent content, violent media can have on people. And something interesting about it too, because the Itchy and Scratchy cartoons are a parody of Tom and Jerry. And, but they're a lot more violent than any actual Tom and Jerry or Bugs Bunny cartoon ever has been. I mean, they're more graphically violent and senselessly violent than like a Roadrunner or Coyote cartoon.
But we also
Uh,
had that when we were growing up. I mean, did you ever watch Eat the Cat?
Eek the Cat.
Yeah.
That was that like on Cartoon Network or something? That was a little bit after my time.
Okay. Well, I think the first seasons were incredibly violent, just like Itchy and Scratchy. It was hilarious. Yeah, and also accessibility to like horror shows and things growing up. I remember my mother used to be really concerned about me because I used to, okay, back then I used to love horror movies and violent shows and action movies. And I also was kind of an antisocial kid. So, of course, out of fear and concern, she always blamed my TV. All you do is watch horror movies. That's why you don't have friends. Da, 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 da. And it's like, no, that's not why. As an adult, I can see why I can see why she reacted that way. It was out of concern. At the time, it
Sure.
felt pretty irrational.
It comes down to parenting, right? I mean, ultimately, I think that yes, there is content that is in theory appropriate or inappropriate for certain ages, whatever it is, but it really depends on ultimately is good parenting, a good education, and everything to be given a certain context. Because what you just said, when you were a kid, you loved horror movies. So did I. I mean, I grew up watching horror movies and action movies and violent movies and all kinds of things. Ever since I was a kid, my parents were never too strict about that. My parents were bohemians, and they would take me to like art houses to watch European films ever since I was a little kid. And I was occasionally exposed to things that, in theory, would be inappropriate for somebody my age. And sometimes it might have even been a miscalculation on their part. But there's a couple of movies, and I remember seeing these two movies like back to back, like a week apart in the mid '80s when I would have been about whatever, like 9 years old or something. And I went to see the first one was Salvador, Oliver Stone's movie Salvador. I don't know if you've seen that one.
No.
Okay, well, in Salvador, James Woods plays a very liberal journalist. James Woods, obviously a brilliant actor in this performance, playing somebody completely different from who he truly has turned out to be, playing this journalist who like goes to El Salvador to investigate stuff that's going on there, and he gets involved in the whole political mess, the assassination of Romero, and all of that. Anyway, it's a very violent, hard-hitting film. And so I look at that movie. Obviously, that's not an appropriate movie for kids to watch, and very violent. But after the movie, I had a discussion with my parents and whatever, and that's fine. It's not like it gave me nightmares. And then maybe a week or two after seeing The Salvador, my stepmom took me to see My Beautiful Laundrette. My Beautiful Laundrette is a great movie. It's a Stephen Frears. It's a romantic comedy about the romance between a Pakistani. It takes place in London. He's a Pakistani whose uncle runs a laundromat in London, and a mod, a punk rocker played by Daniel Day-Lewis.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a love affair. They're homosexuals, and it's a very, for what it is. I mean, it doesn't have like extremely graphic scenes, but pretty graphic. There's very like intense sequences of heavy petting between the two men. They share a bottle of champagne, like swapping champagne into each other's mouths and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very clear that these are two men that are in love, and it's portrayed as a completely positive, good thing. But obviously, it's a film that is very truthful, portraying the prejudices of the time. So there's some violence that happens to them because of this and whatever. But my point is, for a kid like an 8 or 9, that's pretty impactful stuff to see, especially if you're not completely familiar with that stuff.
Yeah.
So my Beautiful Laundrette. So there's a movie that a kid shouldn't see, and yet after that movie, what it inspired me was to talk to my parents about homosexuality, to talk to them about what was that all about, and so they had to have a talk, And my point is, although these are strong R-rated films, my exposure to them was ultimately a positive thing.
Yep.
It was not a damaging thing. I learned about political realities of El Salvador, or I learned about homosexuality, and always with like a positive, or at least an enriching perspective, even though I was exposed to things that were, in theory, inappropriate. So that's why it's relative. right?
We also have to consider like physiological issues, like mental issues. You just reminded me of two things, and one is that yeah, my mother had like problems with watching horror movies, but she's the one that took me to see RoboCop, which is hardly a kids movie. But
No, not at all.
no. And she also took me to see every single Van Damme movie that she could possibly get into because she was really into his ass. So, I think her reaction was just pure concern, but I never had those conversations with my parents. And so far, I haven't killed anyone. That could change, but I haven't felt the need to kill anyone. So I think, yeah, it depends on the case, the particular case. But you just reminded me of a story that I have to tell because it's funny. So, I lived with a Mormon family for a year.
Yes, that's right. Let's
Yes.
have a sequel to that from
yeah.
our first episode together.
Yes.
Hallelujah, milk and honey on the other side. Hallelujah.
Their religion limits what they watch, basically.
Sure.
Especially for kids. So we were visiting their family once. I think it was in Oregon. Yeah. And it was in the morning. We wanted to watch a movie, and Time Cop was there for us to watch. And I thought, yeah, this is a great movie, and it's fun, and there's nothing horrible in it. Well, I forgot there was a really like raunchy sex scene. And as soon as that thing started, it was almost like a cartoon. It was so funny because they couldn't watch it. And to me, like that was never a bad thing.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, you're talking about that scene early on where like Van Damme and Mia Sara are,
Yep.
they're getting it on, and
Yes.
he's like doing what he's got to do. No, because you're right. Because apart from that, Time Cop doesn't really have anything. Well, here's the weird thing. I'll bet you that had it not had that scene, because Time Cop's rated R.
Yeah.
It's an R-rated film, but had it not had that scene, that Mormon family would not have had any problem with the graphic violence that occurs throughout the film.
Yes.
This is a real mess now. I hope you're happy. This is a real mess. You turned what was going to be a simple, ordinary murder into a bloodbath.
I'm still kicking. I must be on Broadway.
It's something that's it's known. And in the U.S., they seem to have a lot more problems with sex than they do with violence.
Yeah, that's so ridiculous.
It's very, you look at it and you go like, so you have a problem with, two people making love, an expression of love, which, as graphic as it may be, this is not a bad act. But you have no problem with like a guy getting his head blown off or whatever it is, So you look at stuff like that, and you go like, well, that's kind of that's a creepy double standard,
Weird cultural thing.
Yeah, it's just a really creepy double standard. And so but it speaks to that because ultimately, and that's so bringing it back to the episode, they're watching these ultra violent Itchy and Scratchy cartoons. And to what I was trying to say before, it's like, it's weird. I think they purposely make the Itchy and Scratchy cartoons much more height and much more extreme. And you brought up what was it, Eek the Cat, and then you could talk about like Ren and Stimpy.
Yeah.
And these things were contemporary of the Simpsons, pretty much. They were all around the same time. But what I think they're really poking fun at, it's a takeoff on the cartoons that the writers grew up watching, which were Tom and Jerry cartoons, or Bugs Bunny, Roadrunner, Coyote cartoons. And there is an important distinction to be made, which, if you look at the Roadrunner and Coyote cartoons or the Tom and Jerry cartoons, you don't have characters inflicting violence directly on each other. Do you know what I mean? Like, typically the villains, like for example the Coyote, for instance, who in my opinion is more like an anti-hero than a villain, but typically the Coyote, like all the violence that happens to either the Coyote or Tom or Sylvester, if it's Sylvester and Tweety, or Elmer Fudd or whoever it is, typically the violence that happens to them, they tend to be victims of their own hubris. In other words, they bring it on themselves. It's like the Coyote sets up an elaborate trap and it blows up in his face, and that's what happens. It's never like Bugs Bunny directly like going after Elmer Fudd and like stabbing him. Like it's always something where in any situation, like my favorite example also is the one where my favorite Bugs Bunny cartoon is the one about the opera singer. I believe it's called What's Opera Doc. I think that's the name of the short, in which Bugs Bunny is like, he's hanging out and it's near like some house where there's an opera singer that lives there. And the opera singer keeps on trying to rehearse, to practice. And Bugs Bunny keeps interrupting him because he's like over there, like playing on his banjo or doing some noisy thing that fucks him up. So he starts getting mad at him, and he always goes and like breaks Bugs Bunny's banjo or breaks his tuba or like whatever he does, right? And so eventually Bugs Bunny decides to take revenge, and the way that he takes revenge is that he impersonates a conductor.
Yes, I did watch it.
Right,
Yeah.
right. You see what I'm saying, right? So
Yep.
so what does he do in that cartoon? Well, yes, he does torture. He does damage this opera singer. Like, that's the only one that maybe you do have. Like, that's one of the only ones I can think of where it's really like Bugs Bunny actually like harming the villain. Usually, the villains bring it on themselves.
Well, the same happened with Tom and Jerry, like the actual Tom and Jerry. Yeah. It was like self-inflicted damage more so than.
Right. It's like Tom tries to grab Jerry, but he slips and he falls, or or whatever it is. Like he sets up a trap and it falls on him, or whatever. And I'm pretty sure that eventually they had some Tom and Jerry cartoons where they were friends. I remember there was this at some point. I don't know if it was always like this, but wasn't it that like they pretended to be enemies because they were actually friends, but so that the owner wouldn't get a new cat, or like wouldn't. So the owner would assume that Tom was doing his job. Tom had to pretend that he was catching Jerry, and so Jerry had to like pretend to get caught or whatever it is. I think there were some cartoons that went down that road. But in Itchy and Scratchy cartoons, though, I mean, it's like Itchy's just like, well, Scratchy's the cat, right? Yeah, so like Scratchy's just like walking around, and then Itchy walks up to him and beats him over the head or something. It's just senseless, sadistic violence. So it's funny the way that they do it, but it's not, like my favorite one, and I don't even think it's in this one. I think it's in a future episode. I think it's in the episode about Homer's brother. Mm-hmm. But it's the one where the cartoon's called Sunday Bloody Sunday, and it basically starts, Scratchy walks into the ice cream parlor where Itchy's running the ice cream parlor, and he just grabs Scratchy and stuffs him in the mixer, like for no reason, and just like turns him into a sundae. So it's just basically like it's Itchy inflicting violence on Scratchy for no reason. Like that's all the cartoons consist of. So it's not about like Scratchy going after him and losing. It's not, which is what the formula is for those cartoons. So it is kind of weird. But anyway, so that's the concept of the show is that, so Marge starts this whole campaign, which in today's vernacular, it would be equivalent to like a big social media campaign. It would be equivalent to quote unquote film Twitter or quote unquote woke Twitter, like going after something for a perceived slight, right? And this massive, because that's how it is. It's a snowball. She starts. She goes on Nightline or whatever it is, and Smartline I think is the Simpsons version. Yeah,
Smartline.
Right, and she's there with Roger Myers, and and Roger Myers just looks like an asshole. Like ultimately, he just looks like an asshole. He can't articulate his retorts cannot be articulated properly. So obviously Marge comes off looking much better, and so like ultimately, this starts off a big chain of events which has huge influence to the point where Roger Myers is getting hate mail.
Yes, but what I found very interesting about that is that, so Marge starts with a letter. Then the programmer responds calling her a screwball. The show is essentially an escalation of people calling out Marge and Marge getting angrier and responding even more strongly.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, initially, she writes a letter, a very polite letter, whatever it is, saying that she thinks it's very violent. And the response she gets from Roger Myers is very obnoxious. And then on top of that, since she's becoming this public figure who's like demonstrating outside the cartoon studios. Don't do that! Don't do that! Hey, don't do that!
Take that, you dumb squirrel.
Right. It's escalation. You're right. Like that's exactly what it's portraying. It's the escalation, how these things snowball, when eventually Marge gets enough people on her side that Roger Myers loses, and so now they're going to censor the cartoons. But here's the thing, because it seems to be a response in a way to people that would have been criticizing, let's say, The Simpsons, because at the time, The Simpsons was criticized for being an edgy show. But they were very clear, in saying that it wasn't meant to be seen by children. It was a primetime show for a family audience, yes. But, they expected it to be seen in prime time. Families would watch it together. So essentially it was a PG show, a PG or PG-13 show, right? Yeah. Where, you can watch it with your kids, but the idea is that kids will watch it with their parents, and so parental guidance is being given. It wasn't intended as entirely a children's program. Mm-hmm. So that's their defense. And then on top of that, you have shows like this where they go like, we understand, but then they kind of pull a cynical trick, because it's like, we do understand, but see, this is what you're really saying, and it shows basically the dangers of where things eventually go.
Yes.
Right? Because the censorship can be very well intentioned. The saying, okay, this is inappropriate for kids. And the way that happened in real life, with Tipper Gore and all of that stuff, that ended up, you putting warning labels on, records. Mm-hmm. Or, they came up with a rating system for video games.
Yeah.
And as I said earlier, these things, I think they're very shallow. I think they're very superficial, but I do think that in essence they work, and that's really the best you can do, because ultimately what it all is about, it goes back, it's about parenting, right? So it's ultimately about letting parents know what the content of this stuff is so they can decide if it's appropriate for their children. Yes. There's no way to make you can't just make this general blanket decision for everyone. It's more about, okay, we're just going to inform you that we're going to come up with a rating system. Or we're just going to put a warning label so you'll know. So like if your son goes to the store to buy this record, brings it home and says explicit lyrics, now you're going to know that there's probably language in those songs that you do not appreciate your son listening to, whatever, right? Or if it's video games, you're going to know that this is a video game that has violent content that's not appropriate for kids. So that's why it's rated, MA13, or that's why it's rated for, mature, or whatever it is, right? So, sure. So that's okay.
Yeah, but it seems to me that people, and generally like parents that go into attack mode with this type of shows, mm-hmm. they either don't have the tools, or they were not raised to openly talk about certain things, so they're not that prepared or willing to talk to their children about context, and therefore right. The only way they can react is by going on the attack, which it's not really productive. I think it's on the part of people that are more open to those themes to kind of be patient. I think that's something that this show it's telling us, is that they're calling each other names. All it does is fuel the fire of each side, and it becomes a never-ending issue.
But then the difference though is that in this episode, what ends up happening isn't warning labels, they end up sanitizing the cartoons.
And it's awful.
Right? And they're these incredibly boring cartoons, because there's no conflict, and it's incredibly boring.
Look, I wonder if that happened to Tom and Jerry as well. I'm pretty sure someone complained.
They share and love and share, love, share, the Itchy and Scratchy Show.
Well, I don't know about Tom and Jerry, to be honest, but I can speak to a little bit to how things like this influenced other media. For instance, comic books. Up until about the mid-50s, comic books were pretty much free to do whatever they wanted to do. And then, Frederick Wortham came out with his book called Seduction of the Innocent, which basically blamed comic books for juvenile delinquency, and then et cetera, et cetera. And so they established the Comics Code. That ended up killing stuff like EC Comics, Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror, because the sorts of comic books they were doing were just too violent. So they could no longer operate. And also Batman comics. Some of the comics in the 50s, some of them are fun to read, but they're just silly. Like they're not. Although people think that the Adam West cartoon, the Adam West TV show, is responsible for making Batman campy. No, Batman was already like campy in the comic book before that show came out. You had just silly schemes, and like there was no violence, there was no death. It was all just silly schemes. I don't know, Batman, like, oh, I must wear a different suit every day of the week. Really dumb things, which are fun to look at, but obviously all very sanitized. They very careful. And then you have also for movies the Hays Code, right? And the Hays Code, this is before rating system was established in the U.S. The Hays Code, where they looked at the content of films, and this started like around the 30s, the mid 30s, early 40s, and so it was like certain things that you couldn't show in movies, things that couldn't be seen. And like, for instance, you couldn't have an evil character, like a criminal, had to pay, had to show remorse by the end of the story, or had to pay for his crime, or just things of that nature, like very moralistic and very following strict formula and guidelines and all this stuff to not offend anyone. What I mean? Because everything had to sort of fall under a sort of follow a strict guideline, because it had to be inoffensive. It had to be inoffensive content.
Horror movies from that time, from like 30s and 40s, it's really interesting to
Mr. Carl Lemley feels it would be a little unkind to present this picture without just a word of friendly warning. We are about to unfold the story of Frankenstein. I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you.
It all comes down to sanitizing and making content accessible to, susceptible people.
One that I did see recently enough, I watched the original Frankenstein from 1931.
Yeah.
And the version that I watched was obviously like from the new Blu-ray, so it's like the complete version.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do know is that at the time that film came out, it was actually censored. It was actually cut. Because, spoiler for a movie that's almost 100 years old by now, Frankenstein accidentally drowns this little girl that he comes across, playing near a lake, and he's very innocently wanting to play with her. I call him Frankenstein, the creature, right? He's playing with the little girl, and he doesn't know what he's doing, and he accidentally, because the girl grabs a pretty flower, throws it into the lake. And then, he grabs a pretty flower and throws it into the lake. And then I guess the mentality is that, oh, that's the game. We throw pretty things into the lake. So he thinks the girl is pretty. So he grabs her and he throws her into the lake, right? Not meaning to hurt her, just, he's playing with her. The point is that she drowns. Now, what I do know is that when this film was originally released, you didn't have that scene. You had him come up and meet the girl and be playing with her, and then it cut away.
Yeah, but there's a law that forbids showing kids being murdered or dying.
Right.
Right?
Right. It was part of the cut. It was like, no, we can't show this. This can't be seen. And so by taking that part out, because I think it cut from him playing with the little girl to the father, like coming into the town screaming that they had killed his little girl. So if you're watching that, you're going to assume that the monster just killed her, like viciously. So you're taking the context out of the story. The idea is that he didn't mean to kill her, and that's it's part of the whole. You take away the context by trying to sanitize it. In a way, you make it worse. You make it more horrible.
Itchy and Scratchy seem to have lost their edge.
I think it conveys a very nice message of sharing.
I think it sucks.
And so what ends up happening here is they sanitize Itchy and Scratchy and they make it really boring. And I mean, that leads to a beautiful sequence, right? Where all the kids just turn off the TV and decide to go out and play.
How realistic is that? I don't get it. It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
It's a beautiful sequence. Yes.
It's gorgeous, but come on. Like, if you take TV away from kids, they're not going to suddenly just go out and play like people used to do before.
It's a pretty thing to consider, right? That, like, the only reason that they're stuck in their houses is because the TV provides so much entertainment. They're like, but Itchy and Scratchy is the only thing they're watching. But it's nice symbolism. Originally, James L. Brooks, he wanted to end the episode with that. He wanted that to be the ending.
Yeah.
You know, that the kids turn off the TV and they go out and they play, and it's this beautiful ending, right?
Nah.
It's kind of like that'd be a pretty sappy ending. You know, like as beautiful as that sequence is, ending it on that note would not be, you know, what would be your point?
It really isn't smart for a show to tell people not to watch TV, because you're
Right.
essentially killing your own business.
In any case, it comes off as hypocritical. So you go like, we're telling you TV is bad, but please tune into our show so we can tell you this.
Hi, kid. Is it Saturday?
It's fine. It's a beautiful sequence, but that's not the message of the show. Ultimately, the message of the show is that this is just a snowball effect. And if you're going to sanitize one thing, but then eventually you open the doors, right?
Oh, yeah.
And that's why you have the whole thing with the parents showing up at her door. They want to censor Michelangelo's David, and you go like, well, that's a work of art. You know, like, why, you know, kids should see this. But that's just it. You know, I think that when you go down this road, you have to apply a broad brush, right? Now, this show focuses on parents, and it's taking its cues from the reality of the time. You know, we had just gotten through the whole Tipper Gore thing, or it was going on at the time. You had the moral majority, people who wanted to, in a way, police the content of entertainment. You know, they wanted to, in a sense, protect people.
Yeah,
from
and it's all about
content.
And it's all about fear, I think. Because a lot of these things, you just need one conversation to contextualize everything, and it's fine. But people are afraid or are not willing to talk.
Yeah, no, it's about fear, but it's also about control.
No, absolutely, control. Yeah.
It's, you know, it's about control. It's about manipulating things, and then you have a lot of quote unquote well-intentioned censorship, right?
Oh yeah.
And then you have, and that's why. So I'm curious because I'd like to see your perspective on this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about this recent thing that has been happening in the U.S. that, as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd, there has been this uptick in people from a corporate point of view wanting to seem sensitive and wanting to show themselves to be supportive and wanting all of this, wanting to showcase this. So, you know, first we had the whole thing with HBO Max pulling Gone with the Wind and bringing it back, you know, a few weeks later or whatever it is with a disclaimer, giving context. And then you have other thing, but then that's one thing. But then you have like that episode of Golden Girls was just taken off, you know, where they have mud on their faces or whatever. And then you have an episode of Community that I think because that was taken off. I don't even know the full reason. An episode of Faulty Towers they wanted to take off from BBC because it had offensive language in one episode. Yeah. So what do you think of this? I'm curious.
Okay, I have two opinions.
Sure.
The first one is that whenever there are really big social changes, there's going to be an overcorrection. And it happened with Me Too, and it's happening now. So that's just going to happen. And I think we have to apply some patience and wait for things to stabilize a little bit, because you're going to see more of those cases. And it's happening with YouTube also. There's this famous YouTuber, Jenna Marbles, that essentially left her platform because she made a video parodying Nicki Minaj. And she used what was perceived as blackface, which it wasn't. She just had a really bad tan, but it was perceived as that. What I've noticed is that a lot of creators are coming out trying to explain and apologize for previous content. Right. So it's happening basically in all platforms, and that's an overcorrection that, look, it creates a certain awareness that is good to have, but a lot of innocent people are going to get hurt, and hopefully it's not like a permanent damage. So that's one of my opinions. The second one is more cynical, and that's that big corporations and, you know, these big companies have to think about their business, and they have to consider people or markets that they haven't reached before. So of course you're gonna see people like trying to be perceived more as inclusive or trying to be more pro women, and that to me is just a business decision. It's not exactly like super legitimate and honest, but if they're thinking about their market and their their earnings, they have to consider that and include it in their business practices. They just have to.
I completely agree with you on both counts. On the first count, like I do think ultimately that like HBO Max pulling Gone with the Wind, there are all these corporations doing these little things of like, oh, let me pull this, let me pull this, let me pull this, just to show how sensitive I am. It's corporate activism. It's completely shallow. It's completely it's meaningless. It's completely meaningless because there is no. It doesn't do anything for the future. Okay, you're burying your past. You're pulling out something. You're trying to apologize for a past mistake by burying it, not even by confronting it, because assuming that they really cared. Let's say that the people in charge that hold the rights to Gone with the Wind truly cared, truly considered it an abhorrent work, a racist work, and they truly felt they could not be associated with it anymore because it's such a horrible piece of work. Well, then okay, then don't be associated with it anymore. Release it into the public domain, and no longer profit from it in any way, and just that's it. And then that's honest. But no, you're holding on to it. You're practicing self-censorship. You're holding on to it, and you'll put it out when you feel like it. But you're giving the impression that you care. What you care about is your profits.
Correct.
Right?
They should have just not said anything, remove it, and add a little disclaimer at the beginning, and that's it.
Like don't call attention to it if you
don't
really
call attention
if it right. And the thing is also, it's not like anybody was asking for it. That's the thing too. It wasn't like somebody. It wasn't like there was this long like any organization or anyone was like, we need this to be pulled. No, it was a reaction. It was like, what can we do?
Yeah, and it's an overreaction that is normal with a change like this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And it's the same for these other these episodes of shows like The Golden Girls. The Golden Girls, which by the way is probably, and still even today, like if you sit down and watch, it was probably the most progressive show of its time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's incredibly progressive with The Golden Girls, how the issues they tackled, the things they talked about in that show back then. And you watch it now and it's still, wow, they were talking about this like 30 years ago or more, almost 40 years ago now. And this was really progressive for the time and touched upon topics. I mean, they were even talking about there's a clip that's making the rounds on social media now, which is actually from the Golden Palace, not from Golden Girls, but which was a spin-off. But it's the same. It's it's spun off from that, and it's this whole thing with Don Cheadle, and the Confederate flag, and it's a very powerful kind of scene, and shows that they were conscious of these things. They were talking about these things even then. So so you want to censor that episode? Did you actually sit down and watch it though? Because that episode that you want to pull actually is commenting on that. It's actually talking about blackface. It's actually talking about perception and these things. It's making a commentary on racism. So the message is valid.
Oh, wait up. You're not hanging that flag in here.
Well, of course I am.
Blanche, do you know what this flag represents?
This flag belonged to Big Granddaddy Hollingsworth. He used to bring it to all our fine old Southern family picnics where all the cousins would gather. It's a grand old flag.
Wait a minute, now I get it. This is just good old-fashioned fun. How about on Tuesday nights we hang the Nazi flag, hire an oompa band, and dress you up like Eva Braun?
Or the episode of Fawlty Towers, which I believe is the one about the Germans, was a funny running gag of don't mention the war, and it's because there's this general, this old British general who uses racist language in the episode. And a character, a villainous asshole character speaks badly, but that's the character. You're not, that of course he speaks this way, but no one is saying that it's right to speak that way. They're just pulling things free of context. you know, and so nobody's sitting down, no one's analyzing anything. So that's why it's meaningless, you know?
Yeah, and sometimes you watch those episodes and they're just really innocent. They're not
Yeah.
really, even if they're not criticizing blackface or whatever it is that's the issue, they're not really bad. They're not, yeah, they're not racist. They're not bad. It's what happened with It's Always Sunny. They had one of their episodes pulled, and that's when they have the parody of the Lethal Weapon sequel. Yeah, it's just an overreaction.
And is it because one of the characters used blackface to be
Yes.
Danny Glover? Is that why?
Yeah, actually two characters and they rotate being Danny Glover. It's really funny.
Right.
But that always happens with everything. I mean, and that's why I'm not opposed to just having a little disclaimer at the beginning or the end, because we already have that
Sure.
with rape scenes, with suicide prevention. That happens. It's okay to put a little disclaimer, just don't call attention to it.
I completely agree. I mean, it's one thing to have a disclaimer, and in fact, that's more honest, because ultimately what you're saying by doing something like that is going like, okay, we are aware of this. We're aware of it, and we are facing it. We are presenting it because we're not going to hide from it. We're not going to pretend it doesn't exist. We're going to say, yeah, here it is. Whether it's an innocent thing like what you were saying, or whether it really is something that has some problematic elements like Gone with the Wind, where you can be like, okay, but let's actually talk about this. This is a movie that was made in this time. You know, it has a portrayal of things that are, you know, of the time, and this is why, and etc. You know, you have this. I think in the case of Gone with the Wind, it's not just a disclaimer. I think it's like this whole 10-minute like intro where they like talk about the movie in detail, and that, like, all of that is fine. I mean, I have no problem with that at all. I think for me the problem is in the whole pulling and burying, the trying to pretend that it's not there, that it didn't exist. The thing is that it seems innocent, you know, or like you can be somebody who's very progressive and you see that and you go like, no, but you know what? If it's a racist, bury it. And you go, yes, because today it's that movie, today it's that show that you don't care about. But trust me, eventually it'll be something you do care about.
Yes.
And then you'll have to twist yourself into a pretzel trying to justify it. Well, I care about it, but you know what? And so, you know, it's better to just be like, you know what? If I'm going to support freedom of speech, if I'm opposed to the idea of censorship, that means that covers everything, even stuff I don't like. You know, even a movie I don't like or a piece of art that I despise. Unfortunately, it counts because I'm standing up for freedom of expression. So that means stuff that I may not like, you know. But I'd rather it exist and people who want to engage with it can engage with it than it be buried and people pretend it didn't exist.
People need to remember, okay, I sound super patronizing right now, but people need to remember that there is an off button on every single device. If you don't want to watch something, just turn it off.
There's a big difference between, let's say, a movie like Gone with the Wind, which is on a streaming service or, you know, on video or whatever. No one's forcing you to watch that. I mean, if you don't feel like watching that movie, you have no reason to. It's different, though. Like if you're driving, if every day as you're going to work, you have to drive past a statue of this horrible person, you know, some Southern general that oppressed, you know, your ancestors, and you have to be reminded of that every time you're driving to work. Okay, I get that. You know, here's this horrible thing that's being put up there as if this was some kind of a hero, and you know, you're driving to work and you have to look at that every fucking morning. I get that. Yeah, get that thing out of there. But no one's forcing you to watch Gone with the Wind. No one's forcing you to watch that episode of Golden Girls or whatever else, right?
Yeah.
So I think that. And that's where the balance has to come in.
This is Myers. I'm here with the writers. Listen, you're so smart. How do we end this picture? Itchy just stole Scratchy's ice cream cone. Anyway, Scratchy is understandably upset.
Mm-hmm.
So we figured he could, you know, just grab Itchy and toss him in a bucket of acid.
Oh, dear.
But then we remembered that this might be interpreted as violence, which is morally wrong now, thanks to you. So what's your big idea? How do we end this?
What do we think of this episode? We haven't talked too much about it, but let's get back on track.
Can we talk about Smartline for a bit?
Yes, we can.
It's incredibly reflective of what happens right now with these televised forums when they bring people with supposed different opinions. And most times all they do is like give each other like, I don't know, they just look at each other like they're the enemy and they talk and sometimes they fight and the argument goes nowhere.
Pretty much. I mean, I think it's shows like that have always existed, right? So that's, you watch one of the panels on CNN or Fox News or whatever, they all have this basic format where you have a bunch of talking heads, and everyone's just speaking in a vacuum. I mean, they all have their little talking points, whether they're on one side or the other. It's all just talking points. They're sniping at each other. That's all they're doing.
Now, what in the world is wrong with that, Mrs. Simpson?
There's nothing wrong with it.
Excuse me, he was addressing me.
I know, there's nothing wrong with it.
Excuse me, there is. I think that it's a bad influence on children.
Give me a break. I think that is a bunch of baloney. And here's why. In preparing for this debate, I did a little research and I discovered a startling thing. There was violence in the past long before cartoons were invented.
I see. Fascinating.
When you're having these arguments, it's very difficult because they come from an emotional place.
Yeah.
You know, Marge Simpson railing against the cartoon violence, it's coming from a real place. It's because she saw her husband attacked, you know, by Maggie. And and she knows for a fact, because she was there and she saw it, she knows for a fact that it was because of the cartoon. You know? So in her case, it's true. And then what Roger Myers is saying is like, well, you know, that may be, but that doesn't necessarily mean that cartoons cause violence.
Yes.
It's a much deeper problem. And censoring a cartoon or censoring a movie or censoring a TV show, the problems in society are not caused by the entertainment. The entertainment is a reflection. The problems are reflected in the entertainment that is produced. That's why certain movies come out in certain times, because they're reflecting the reality of society around them. It's not that they are influencing that society. It's that they're always going to be a response to what's happening. So, so a violent act is being commented on by art. It's not really, you know, art doesn't influence violence. Violence influences art. But when you're forced into an argument like that, if you're an idiot like Roger Myers, you're going to say, oh, violence has been around since the time of the Crusades when there were no cartoons. And so, like, you know, you'll just sound like an idiot. But, you know, ultimately what you're saying is not untrue.
I don't believe this. I will never watch your show, buy any of your products, or break if I see you crossing the street. Wow, that's cold. Dear sleaze merchant. Oh, come on, that hurts. Gentlemen, the screwballs have spoken.
What is our final verdict of this episode? What do we think of it? Do we think this episode holds up?
It holds up, and it felt like it was predicting the future. Because it's just very topical. It's like it was made for now.
Well, this was a great talk.
Yeah.
Great talk. Yeah, we touched on some nice topics. This was very like topical. This episode really goes into some issues that continue to be relevant today, and I'm glad we had this talk. It's a great episode. It's you know, it's the second half of the season where things really start picking up. I mean, there's a couple of ups and downs, but it's basically like here's where we start seeing the real quality uptick.
We still haven't found where the Simpsons starts to suck. Not yet.
No, not yet. No, not yet. No, we're in fact we're kind of on the roller coaster. If this were a roller coaster, we're still sort of on the you know, we're going up. You know, we're about to get to the peak. We haven't found the place where it started to suck, but we haven't really gotten to the part where it started to be great either. So it's like, you know, we're still sort of on that uptick, right? So it'll be an interesting ride. And I will have you here in a couple of weeks, literally in a couple of weeks, to talk about the one about the blowfish, I believe.
Oh, that's a special one.
So that'll be a fun one to talk about.
Yes.
And that'll be great. So see you next time.
Bye.
Bye. So that's it for this week's installment of the Simpsons Countdown. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please give us a like. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. If you have a minute, a brief review might actually help boost the podcast's profile on whatever platform you're listening to it on. And if it isn't too much trouble, please do share this with all your friends, both virtual and actual, on social media. Your support by spreading the word is much appreciated. And of course, you have every right to disagree with any points made by my guest or I. And you can go ahead and comment your disagreement. Just remember to keep things within the parameters of respect and civility. We're all friends here, after all. I'm Erix Antoine. I'll be back next Thursday evening to talk about Bart Gets Hit by a Car, the very aptly named episode where Mr. Burns runs Bart over with his Rolls Royce or whatever that car is, and we meet Lionel Hutz, the blue-haired lawyer that's supposed to be Roy Cohn. My good friend Ariani will be calling in from the mythical land of New Jersey to talk about that one. And I hope you'll join us. Until then, stay safe out there, continue observing your biosafety, and and social distancing protocols, because whether your area is opening up or not, we are not quite through this thing. And we need everyone to do their part, keeping themselves and everyone else healthy. And we'll get through this in due time. Thank you for listening. See you next week.
So if any of you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such... Shh!